Day 1. Lynn woke up, uncomfortable and confused. It took her a few seconds to pry her eyes open. She found solace in the familiar sight of her bedroom ceiling. The nightmare that had disturbed her sleep lingered in her mind. She had felt like she couldn't breathe, which had always been a particular fear of hers. When she finally managed to open her eyes fully, she noticed John sleeping beside her. His body was partially on top of hers, but not enough to suffocate her. She pushed him to the side, and he immediately started snoring. She tried to remember what had woken her up from her deep slumber. It wasn't just the nightmare. Still feeling a bit groggy, her mind wandered back. On the pretext of finalizing the contract they had been working on together for months, John and Lynn had left the office before lunch and went to her place for a lunch break. Maybe it wasn't the best idea to share a bottle of sparkling juice before the important signing later that evening, but she wanted it to be special, and it went well with the food she had prepared. Why not celebrate the biggest contract their company had ever landed in style? Being chosen for this project meant that Lynn was on the fast track to becoming a company favorite. She also wanted to celebrate a change in her personal life, a change she was looking forward to. That brought her back to the man sleeping next to her. They had started seeing each other about 6 weeks ago. The stress and long hours they shared as lawyers and colleagues had created a bond that naturally led to their current relationship. Once they crossed that line, crossing it multiple times afterwards didn't seem like a big deal to Lynn. Still a bit confused, Lynn tried to remember how they ended up like this. A smile formed on her lips as the details came back to her. With 6 hours to spare and so much to celebrate, she fed him snacks she had prepared, poured some sparkling juice into their glasses, and took a sip from his glass. Lynn couldn't help but think that this was the life: good food, good drink, and the anticipation of great times to come. In the present moment, Lynn wondered how much juice they had consumed. With some effort, she tried to remember. They had nearly finished the bottle, taking turns sipping from their glasses. Her mind was still hazy, but she recalled holding the last sip, without breaking eye contact with John. Lynn, still a bit groggy, struggled to remember. Not only were her memories fuzzy, but the excitement that they initially brought to her seemed to have diminished. A moment of concentration helped her realize the reason for that. She desperately needed to use the bathroom. With great effort, she cast her grogginess aside and rushed to the bathroom. The weak morning light seeping through the frosted glass of the bathroom window triggered memories of happier times. "Oh no," Lynn muttered as she realized it was the dawn chorus of birds outside. The realization sent a chill down her spine as the truth hit her. It was almost 17 hours after she and John were supposed to sign the most important deal in their company's history, and they had slept through it. Panic washed over Lynn as she felt her perfect world crashing down. She knew she had to get to work immediately and salvage what she could. Lynn hurried back to the bedroom and vigorously shook John's shoulders until he groggily opened his eyes. "Get up, you idiot. We slept through the night. It's almost 8 and our careers are in jeopardy." Lynn impatiently watched as John snapped out of his daze in a matter of seconds. He jumped out of bed and stumbled as he rushed downstairs to get dressed. Lynn followed closely, knowing that berating him further would only slow him down. Something caught Lynn's attention, and she glanced towards the front door. To her confusion, she noticed that it was partially open, with the safety chain being the only thing holding it back. Vague memories of the door being opened and rattling against the chain flickered in her mind as the reason for her earlier awakening. She continued staring at the cracked door when a shadow moved against it. Suddenly, something long whizzed through the crack and hit the chain. The screws flew from the bracket, the latch swung and shattered the glass above, causing the door to fully swing open. Anger personified stood before Lynn and John. She was barely 5 feet tall, but almost as wide, with obvious Mediterranean features. An axe hung from her arm, and her eyes blazed with fury as she scanned the room before focusing on the seated man and half-dressed woman. Lynn heard a gasp from behind her, realizing it came from John. "You deceitful little jerk. They were right. You've been cheating on me while I was out of town taking care of my mom." If the furious woman said anything coherent after that, Lynn couldn't comprehend it. Seeing the axe raised and the woman taking her first step towards them, Lynn immediately raced up the stairs, struggling slightly. Halfway up, John pushed her the rest of the way, taking the steps 3 at a time. They ran together towards the only refuge they could find, the master bedroom. Behind the locked door, they anxiously listened as heavy footsteps ascended the stairs. A brief silence was interrupted by the crash of an axe splitting through the door. The flimsy barrier moved, making it clear that it wouldn't hold for long. Lynn retreated to the balcony door, opening it wide. She debated whether to make the 3-meter drop, but before she could decide, the axe finally made it through the door. When she saw John hurtling towards her, she knew she couldn't be the only one left alone in a room with that. Lynn grabbed the balcony railing, hoisted herself over it, and let go, landing clumsily on her feet before falling on her bottom, slightly winded. John, following her lead, also jumped over the balcony. Unfortunately, he landed awkwardly and twisted his ankle, emitting a painful yelp. Lynn's desire to escape propelled her forward, and she immediately sprinted away. Her instincts led her to the carport. As she entered the area, she noticed a strange car blocking hers. She grabbed her purse from her own car and headed towards the exit, only for John to painfully catch up. "Where's my car? We don't have time for that." Lynn hurried to the unfamiliar car, glancing around for any signs of pursuit. Her eyes fell on the keys hanging from the ignition. That was good news. The not-so-good news was the manual gear shift. Lynn had never bothered to learn how to use it. She quickly weighed her options, but the sound of an angry presence approaching signaled that she had no choice. "You drive, John." "I can't, Lynn. My ankle is injured." "You'll have to." Internal debate was useless. Lynn jumped in the driver's seat, and John hobbled around to the passenger side. She started the engine just fine, then asked what to do next. John looked at her, terrified and confused, until realization dawned. He told her to press the pedal on the left, then forcefully shifted it into reverse himself. Somehow the car avoided stalling as Lynn released the clutch and hit the accelerator. As they shot backwards out of the driveway, a swinging axe put a large dent in the windshield, right in front of John. Lynn backed up the street until the armed woman chasing them gave up. With the luxury of time, John coached Lynn through turning around. This included Lynn stalling twice. Lynn thought their first priority was to get to their work as quickly as possible to salvage the contract that had been put in jeopardy by their sleep-in. She was annoyed that, after the adrenaline of the past 5 minutes had started to fade, all John could do was complain about his sore ankle, then slump into semi-consciousness, waking up only when Lynn forced him to answer questions. "I take it that was your wife?" "Yes." "How did she get the front door of my house open?" "It was deadlocked and everything. Thank goodness the safety chain was on, or she would have caught us red-handed." That didn't require a response, so didn't get one. Just before they got to their destination, the engine alternately whining with over-revs, or shuddering due to being in too high a gear, John woke up. "Lynn, where was my car?" "I did drive it to your place yesterday, didn't I?" Lynn didn't respond. She was still a little disoriented by the loss of a big chunk of time. Then being awakened this morning at a time she didn't expect and in a very stressful manner, well, that threw her. She was only half listening to John's next words. "Can we stop for a coffee or something? How much did we drink yesterday?" She was distracted from those thoughts, firstly by John's snore and then their arrival at their place of business. Outside the door, Lynn looked at John's disheveled state, then became aware of her own. She could only imagine how she looked. "Let's go into the bathrooms and freshen up a bit. Meet me in my office, then we'll go and see Mr. Biggs." Neither took any notice of the receptionist picking up the phone as they headed for the stairs. They were each heading for the bathroom on their floor when they heard their names called. Mr. Biggs, the managing partner, was standing outside his office door. They couldn't ignore his crooked finger gesturing them both to enter his office. Preceding them in, he closed the door firmly, then walked behind his desk, glaring at them the whole time. Lynn saw herself reflected in John's unkempt hair, rumpled clothes, and exhausted looks. Finally, Mr. Biggs broke the silence. "Care to give me some explanation on why I spent all last night and this morning trying to salvage a contract after you stood up our client? Why I couldn't get either of you idiots on the phone when they rang me at 6 last night?" Lynn ran various responses quickly through her mind. This was not good. It could put her career back a couple of years. This allowed a still groggy John to answer the uncomfortable questions. "Sorry, boss, we overslept." This response, coupled with their appearance, including Lynn's smeared makeup and improperly buttoned clothes, told Mr. Biggs all he needed to know. In all his career, he'd never seen two such talented rising stars commit professional suicide quite so effectively. He paused as a plan formed in his mind. Maybe he could salvage the contract, but only if he offered the clients a couple of scapegoats. You two are suspended pending an investigation into your behavior. I suggest if you clean out your desks now, it may save you time later and save me the need to lay eyes on your foolish faces ever again. Lynn and John both bowed their heads in shame. John turned for the door first, followed by Lynn. Mr. Biggs' next words were so soft, she almost missed them. This will devastate your husband, Lynn. Whenever we play golf together, it's always Lynn did this, or Lynn said that. I don't know how I'll be able to face him after this. That almost made Lynn stumble as she began the walk of shame to her office. Just outside the door, they were intercepted by the assets manager. John, where were you last night? Where's your company car? John shook his head. This is serious. Did you drive your car last night? I don't think so. I went to sleep yesterday afternoon and didn't wake up until this morning. My car was missing. Did you report it stolen to the police? John just shook his head again. Well, if I were you, I'd call the police straight away. They rang this morning to see who was assigned that car. Apparently, whoever stole it from your place used it to crash into the local biker hangout. 2 of their guys were injured when it came through the wall of their clubhouse. You might want to think of a more convincing alibi before you call them. John turned to look at Lynn in utter confusion. She had no answers to give him. Lynn strode and John hobbled to their respective offices. As they left with their personal items in file boxes, they had to endure the indignity of the admin manager looking through the boxes to ensure no company equipment or data was being removed. Their colleagues stood silent witness as they were escorted to the door. They put the boxes in the back of John's wife's car. Lynn pushed John away when he came in for a comforting hug. All that had happened in the last hour was because he didn't wake them up yesterday afternoon. Still stunned, they both sat in the front seat collecting their thoughts, John in the driver's seat. Lynn looked at herself for the first time that day, then at John and saw them as their boss had. How incredibly foolish had they been. John proved he was finally back to reality when he spoke next. Job and marriage ruined in one day. Wow. Lynn was about to reprimand him for his silly and unhelpful comment when a screech of tires drew their attention to the parking lot entrance. John gasped at what he saw. Oh no. Carlos. He quickly started the car and gasped as his injured ankle depressed the clutch pedal. They took off, heading out the entrance. They passed John's wife in the passenger seat of the unfamiliar car. The driver was big and angry. He glared at them as they passed. Who on earth is Carlos? My wife's brother. He's bad news. I'm talking mob bad. He spent more time in jail than out, and he has never liked me. His first time in prison was because he beat up some guy at school for saying Maria was easy behind her back. Oh no, now you tell me, you fool. As John sped away, Lynn was relieved to see the other car blocked as it attempted a quick U-turn. Lynn directed John to make a couple of quick turns as soon as they were out of sight. 5 minutes later, there was no sign of pursuit, and they were on one of the freeways through the city. They discussed where to go but could come to no agreement. Obviously, John's house was out of the question, and now they knew that Maria was aware of where Lynn lived, so her place was also off limits. They were no closer to deciding a destination when John reached to the dashboard and turned on a device. He explained that it was his wife's habit of listening on the police radio channel. It's legal unless a person uses the information so gained in any way. The airwaves were busy giving the license plate number and description of the car they were in. It had been reported stolen and was linked to the crash from the previous night. Lynn and John had no time to process this before they saw flashing lights off to the side and heard the sirens wailing. Lynn turned to see a motorcycle policeman alongside them, with the rider gesturing for them to pull over. She told John to obey. The police motorcycle pulled in right in front of them. The cyclist got off and calmly removed his helmet before walking towards them, looking at the broken windscreen. The pair sat silently as the policeman leaned in John's window. To their surprise, he asked if they knew it was against the law to drive with the screen in that condition. With relief, they realized he hadn't heard the recent news reports. John gave his name and address because he couldn't produce a license. They held their breath as the police officer returned to his bike, retrieved an iPad-type device, and began typing. Just as he looked back at them with concern, their attention was drawn to the sound of loud, decelerating Harleys. They were going the opposite way, about 10 of them. The last few of them had their heads turned towards Lynn and John. The rest were slowing down, looking for a gap in the railing to cross the median strip. John reacted instinctively. He started the car, shifted gears, and took off. His plan, if he even had one, was to pass the motorcycle policeman on the inside and accelerate along the shoulder until he had the speed to merge into the traffic. He was so focused on looking in the side mirror that he missed the policeman's sudden movement. Hearing the car start behind him, the policeman stepped away from the bike and the road. Lynn's yell came too late to prevent him from hitting the guy with the outside wing. Stopping wasn't an option, so John continued to accelerate. In her mirror, Lynn watched in horror as the policeman tried to roll onto his feet. An impossible task with his legs sticking out at such an unnatural angle. Lynn released her frustrations at her driver. John, trying to ignore her, just merged into the flow of cars, then weaved in and out of the traffic at well above the speed limit. With no sign of pursuit, John took the second next exit and headed away from the freeway on increasingly minor roads. They both winced whenever they saw a motorcycle. 5 minutes later, they spotted a shopping center parking lot and pulled in to let the aftermath of the adrenaline rush wash over them. Lynn kept up a steady stream of criticism towards both John's judgment and driving skills. He closed his eyes and tried to ignore her. He vaguely wondered which of their pursuers he should worry about the most. The police would arrest him and ruin what was left of his career. If he was lucky, the bikers would just beat him up. Maybe even cause him severe harm. No, they were weak. The real threat was Carlos. If he almost injured the kid in school because he insulted his sister, how much trouble was John in? To distract himself, he searched through his wife's glove compartment until he found an old multi-tool. After explaining his plan to Lynn, she stood guard while he removed the license plates from the car next to theirs. He put them on their car, then as an afterthought, put their old ones on the other car. It was less noticeable than leaving it uncovered. They needed to buy time until they figured out what to do. They then took off on the road leading further out of town, pulling into a secluded spot along a river. Exhausted and weary, they reclined the seats back and rested. As an afterthought, John suggested Lynn turned her phone off to prevent it from being traced. "What do we do now, John?" "I don't know, Lynn. I don't have a phone, wallet, or money. If I show up back at my place before things calm down, I'm in trouble. The same goes for any of my family's places, I assume. What about your place? They might be watching it, but we could sneak in. Surely your husband will help us, right? I don't know if we'll be welcome there. Why not? You said he knew about us and was okay with it." "Well, I may have exaggerated a little about that. Yes, he did know about us, but I might have made it sound better than it actually was, so you could relax. So, you mean I have to worry about an upset husband on top of everything else?" "Geez, no, he's not like that. He's not malicious and wouldn't hurt a fly. He's a pharmacist, and I think they take the same oath as doctors, to do no harm." "So, he didn't handle the news well then?" "No. He confronted me last week. Knew your name and everything. Gave me an ultimatum. Me, like an arrogant person though, I told him to go away. I wanted it all. A successful career, a nice house and car, a comfortable husband and family. I told him I demanded to have a partner that made me happy. If he couldn't accept that, I would get a lawyer to divorce him and he'd end up with nothing. I was bluffing, but he didn't know that. He loves our children more than anything. I half expected him to call my bluff, but he just left. I haven't seen him since. The next day, I dropped the kids off at my parents' and met you at that motel. Last Monday, remember? Despite everything they had experienced that day, John was horrified to be sharing a car and a nightmare with the person Lynn revealed herself to be. It took him minutes to regain his ability to speak, so you gave him a choice: accept you cheating on him or lose everything. Why not? The law says I can get away with it, so why wouldn't I? Why are you so shocked? Weren't you also cheating on your wife?" "Yes, I was, but I didn't insist on destroying her to do it." "Sorry for the inappropriate joke." Lynn shrugged. John saw Lynn in a completely different way. With his blinders off, he realized that the smile he had found sensual until now had a harsh edge to it. He couldn't fathom such cruelty as the one she nonchalantly described, as if she had no guilt. For her part, Lynn wondered where she could find a drink. She still had that awful metallic taste in her mouth. She joined John in dozing off until hunger woke her in the late afternoon. She woke up before him and turned her phone on to quickly text her mother to take care of the kids indefinitely. She didn't know what lies were being told to her parents. When John woke up, they discussed the strange occurrences of the previous days, trying to avoid the difficult question of what the heck do we do next. Not showing up for a business contract signing after being caught together had surely cost them their jobs, but what made them sleep for a solid 17 hours? And how did John's wife not only know where to find him but also have a way to enter the front door? They knew that if it weren't for the door chain, they would have both been seriously harmed. They had seen the look in Maria's eyes. They were stuck on this point when Lynn caught a glimpse of Carlos's car slowly cruising down the road, visible through the trees. It kept going, however, and as soon as it disappeared around a corner, they went in the opposite direction. John was angered when he found out that Lynn had turned her phone on earlier. He reached over to grab it and throw it out the window, but she protected it. Again, they quickly changed directions and headed in a completely different way. That didn't matter. They didn't have a destination in mind anyway. It was 2 hours before sunset when they passed a remote gas station about 200 kilometers from home. John took a risk and pulled in, glancing at the fuel gauge. While he filled up the tank at the automated gas pump, Lynn went inside to use the restroom, grabbed some food, and then went to the counter to pay. 2 attempts to pay with her debit card were unsuccessful. She checked how much cash she had while the attendant tried her credit card. That was also declined. Just then, the attendant looked over her shoulder and asked what her husband was gesturing to. Lynn turned and saw John frantically motioning at her. She ran out of the office, ignoring the shouts of the shop assistant about the food she still held. She briskly walked over to him. He was rambling about 2 bikers who had just arrived. One of them had immediately taken out his phone. Lynn ordered him to get in the car and go. John obeyed, and they sped off. Lynn watched in the rearview mirror as the bikers began chasing them. She didn't think it was the right time to burden him with the fact that the police had canceled her cards to prevent them from being used. They had only traveled a couple of kilometers when the sound of revving motorcycles could be heard over their own roaring engine. 1 bike was on each side of their car. John steered into the middle of the road as they went around a corner. As soon as they hit the next straight road, the bike behind their left side accelerated to pass them. Reflexively, John moved slightly to the left. That gave the biker on the right an opportunity. He was level with the rear door when John saw him in the mirror. Purely out of instinct, he jerked the wheel to the right. He didn't hit the biker, but the cyclist's instinct was to veer off as well. Right off the side of the road. Lynn watched with fascination as the bike went into the ditch before launching the rider off. She observed as his friend slowed down and turned around to help him. John, with adrenaline pumping through his veins, asked Lynn if she noticed what was on the bikers' jackets. When she mentioned that it depicted a man in a sombrero, John groaned and explained that it was the Bandidos, a club known for their violent reputation. Both the driver and the passenger anxiously watched the fuel gauge. John had just started fueling up when the bikes arrived. Right at dusk, with the fuel gauge nearly full, John pulled off into a quiet country road and turned off the engine. In the fading daylight, they could see a farm and some outbuildings several hundred meters away. Separated from the rest, on a stand, was what appeared to be a large tank, complete with a hose and nozzle. John surveyed the area in the dim light. Lights were on in the farmhouse, but there was no one in sight otherwise. He checked to see if the fuel nozzle was locked, and when he pressed the trigger, liquid came out. He searched the surroundings for a container but found none. He debated whether or not to turn his phone on and use the flashlight function. Concern about being traced won over the desire to keep moving. John returned to the car and, with Lynn, crouched down and waited. The plan was to wait until midnight, push the car to the pump, refuel, and continue to flee. To pass the time until the lights in the farmhouse went out, John and Lynn started discussing the strange events of the past day and listed who might be after them. First, they had fallen asleep while being close in Lynn's bed. That in itself was not unusual, but sleeping for over 17 hours was. Unconsciously, Lynn grabbed the remaining packet of potato chips she had stolen from the roadside shack. Maybe they would get rid of the lingering taste in her mouth. Most of what had happened since they woke up that morning, or was it a week ago, was a result of John's car seemingly being used to crash into the local biker hangout. Obviously, it had been stolen, and given time, John could have convinced the bikers of that. That was all irrelevant now, after they had hurt or perhaps killed someone while escaping from the shack. Through the hopeful eyes of those in these types of situations, they analyzed the motivations and intentions of those against them. John believed that his wife and brother-in-law would be satisfied by a light scuffle, followed by a quick divorce that prioritized his wife's needs. The police? What did they know? Only that he had accidentally hit and injured an officer while fleeing. Fleeing was justifiable considering the bikers. Would the injury result in jail time? They both considered it a remote possibility. It was an understandable accident, after all. That left only the bikers. John suggested that their reputation had been exaggerated by the media, and they weren't actually as tough as everyone claimed. Lynn dismissed that optimistic viewpoint. Her husband used to be in a motorcycle club. He had described a culture of illegal activities that was an accepted way of life, and violence was common. Her husband's role in the club was to steal cars, either for sale or for their various unlawful activities. It became clear to John that Lynn was incredibly fearful of the bikers due to her memories of those stories. She went on to describe how her husband had left the criminal life, found a legitimate job, and worked his way through university. It was evident that Lynn was very proud of her pharmacist husband. The car fell silent, and they waited until the lights in the farmhouse went out. Together, John and Lynn struggled to push the car to the gas station. Nervously and out of breath, John opened the fuel cap on the car and started filling it up. The gasoline poured nicely into the tank until it overflowed. Hesitantly returning to the driver's side, he got in, started the engine, and swiftly accelerated so that the farmer wouldn't spot them and give a description to the police. Just as they reached the farm gate, about 50 meters away, the car hesitated. 20 meters later, all the lights on the dashboard lit up as the engine died. Looking out the back window, Lynn urged John to restart it. Despite continuous attempts, it refused to start. A terrifying thought struck Lynn. Is this car gasoline or diesel? Gasoline? It needs premium gasoline, I believe. And what was in that pump? Doesn't most farm equipment run on diesel? How would I know? I'm from the city. They began yelling at each other and continued until the farmer yanked open John's door and dragged him out. Pressing him against the car, he angrily demanded to know what was happening. Lynn took advantage of the situation and jumped out. The car was blocking the gateway, so she had to go around the back and along the driver's side. As she passed the struggling pair, she noticed a short piece of a tree branch, about 3 inches thick and 3 feet long. The thought of being on the run alone was terrifying enough. With only a second of hesitation, Lynn picked up the branch and swung it at the farmer's back. He fell to the ground. Wide-eyed, they looked at each other, and then John limped after Lynn as she fled toward the highway, using the branch as a walking stick. They didn't hesitate when they reached the highway. They simply started walking in the direction they had been going all day, towards nothing in particular. Away from everything familiar, they stepped off the road whenever a car approached. 2 hours later, they passed a sign stating that the next town was still 10 kilometers away. They were both mentally and physically exhausted. John's ankle throbbed with pain and Lynn could feel blisters forming on her feet. They spotted a solitary barn and pushed through the fence to reach it. There was enough hay inside to serve as a decent bed. They both collapsed into an uneasy sleep. Day 2, Lynn woke up well before dawn. Still tired, hungry, and thirsty, she felt slightly disoriented, not realizing where she was at first. The metallic taste lingering in her mouth brought back the unpleasant memories of the previous day. Strangely, her first coherent thought was of her children. Despite her recent selfish behavior, Lynn loved her children deeply. If she could avoid danger and imprisonment, she would return home, embrace her children like never before, and wait for her husband to seek forgiveness. With time, they could rebuild their normal lives. These were all unrealistic fantasies, but her desperate mind clung to them in her exhausted state. How much trouble was she really in, Lynn wondered. John's wife and her brother were after John, not her. If she could reach the police, they would protect her. It was John's car that had been used in the illegal activity, and it was John who had injured the biker. They were after him, not her. Once again, the police could shield her from them. That only left the police to worry about. What had she truly done wrong? Stolen some items from a roadside store without paying. Hardly a serious offense. Oh no. Now she had also assaulted a farmer. That was definitely a crime. But how would the world know it was her who did it? The solution to all her problems suddenly became clear. If she left John sleeping and made it to the nearest police station before him, she could shift most of the blame onto him, even claiming that he committed the assault on the farmer. By turning him in, all she would face was a minor punishment. Once the world knew where he was, they would forget about her and she could return home quietly. Lynn considered her conscience while forming this plan. Could she betray her lover like this? Like most relationships that start with infidelity, Lynn realized that theirs was doomed from the beginning. He was merely a temporary partner when she needed one. Besides, he was also unfaithful. She could never trust him enough for a long-term relationship. Lynn smiled to herself and prepared to sneak away from the barn. A faint rustling noise caught her attention. In the moonlight, she saw John silently picking up his shoes and leaving the barn. Instinctively, Lynn knew what he was up to. After his own internal debate, John, the betrayer, had decided to report her to the authorities. Angry, Lynn jumped to her feet, grabbed her walking stick, and struck John on the head. He fell and stayed down. Taking off his shoes, she threw them in different directions into the darkness. Lynn adjusted her plan. She would claim self-defense when explaining this incident to the police. Determined, Lynn strode toward town. An unknown amount of time later, Lynn cautiously turned on her phone to check the time and distance to the town. As she did so, it began to operate and change screens on its own. In a panic, she realized that someone was remotely controlling it. Only one person could do that, the person whose phone it was paired with. Why would her husband be trying to find her? No, she thought the police must have insisted that he hand over his phone. Lynn quickly removed the battery and continued toward town, keeping her ears alert for the sound of approaching vehicles in the pre-dawn darkness. As she walked, she strategized. She would accept the consequences for her wrongdoings, then demand that her husband come back home. If he refused, she would use her secret savings, which she had been silently putting away from her own salary in a separate bank account, to file for a divorce. Not wanting to work and in no hurry to find a new job, she would demand the maximum child support while making it difficult for him to see their children. After he had groveled enough, she might consider taking him back. However, if he objected to her finding a new partner, he would know exactly what awaited him. Even her boiling rage couldn't mask the pain in her feet from the improper footwear after she had walked about a third of the way to town. Her blisters had blisters. But she trudged onward. She managed to stumble into town. The police station was midway along the main street, but a sign on the door indicated that it wouldn't be staffed until 9 a.m. She estimated it was around 7, so she sat on the steps and waited. She had no idea how much time passed, but she gradually became aware of a growing rumble. It dawned on her, even in her exhausted state, that it was the sound of motorcycles. Many, many motorcycles. Jumping to her feet, she ran around the side of the police station and hid in some bushes. Peering out, she saw pairs of bikers stopping every 50 meters along the main street, dismounting and scanning the area. The door of the police station opened, and a uniformed officer with stripes on his sleeves stepped out onto the curb and surveyed the street. Lynn sprang up and darted into the open door. Surprisingly, the police officer followed her inside. The sergeant was very interested to hear who she was. When she told them where John had been when she last saw him, he quickly took action and gave orders to his unit on patrol. He then made some other calls before interviewing Lynn properly. She was very helpful, and soon he had a witness statement attesting to 2 assaults by motor vehicle and an assault on the farmer. Partway through, a groggy John was brought in. The sergeant took one look at him and called an ambulance. When it arrived and John was placed on a stretcher and loaded, the bikers closed in but were kept at bay by the police escort. As the ambulance and escort drove off, Lynn, peering around the doorframe, saw John's brother-in-law sprinting for his car and a ton of bikers racing for their rides. Things quietened down again, and Lynn finished her statement. She denied knowing anything about how John was injured. With only shoplifting to her name, Lynn was formally charged and told she could go. With her part in the serious injury of an officer, the police weren't at all helpful about letting her use a phone, and her mobile having gone flat, she decided to walk to the nearest payphone to make a call. To who, she hadn't yet decided. Suddenly, all chaos broke loose in the station. Gradually, Lynn pieced the story together. The ambulance and escort had been taken over by unidentified bikers and others. Luckily, no one resisted and everyone was unharmed. John was missing. Lynn sighed. Now there was no one to refute her side of the story. She stepped out into the street and saw half a dozen bikers in either direction, looking at her. She ran back inside and asked for protective custody. Still in an unforgiving mood, the sergeant laughed and asked for what? Shoplifting? She was told that as it was public property, they couldn't force her to leave until 5 p.m. When they closed, Lynn begged and pleaded, but the sergeant was vindictively adamant. Just before 5, she checked to see if the bikers were still there. They were. Lynn, sore, hungry, tired, and weary beyond belief, felt she had no choice. Dropping her chin to her chest, she turned and walked back into the station. 15 minutes later, the sergeant had a confession to 2 serious assaults, and Lynn took residency of a nice, safe cell. Epilogue: Lynn's husband put down the phone. The call from his lawyer had told him not to expect his wife home in the next 5 years or so. It also predicted one of the quickest and most one-sided divorces in history. He glanced toward the tempting bottle of Lafroig. He'd been drinking too much in the last month or so. Ever since his and Lynn's wedding anniversary, he'd been at work and needed the date for a form. Glancing at the calendar, his heart sank as he realized it was their anniversary. Like the last time he forgot it, he predicted he was going to get in trouble when he got home. He was just in the middle of arranging to leave early to buy a gift when Lynn rang. She had to work late that night. She'd obviously forgotten their anniversary as well, which was very out of character for her. Something must really be distracting her. He did leave early and did buy her a nice necklace, then was home in time to meet the kids from school and make them a healthy dinner. Lynn came home after 9 and he looked at her without much emotion for once. She avoided coming over for the customary hug or even making eye contact. With blinkers off, he could see she was freshly showered. The hair on the nape of her neck was still damp. There was no mention of the missed anniversary. He was lucky that she was so busy hiding her own behavior that she totally failed to spot his unusual one. The rest was easy. He waited for her to work late again, followed her from her office to a restaurant, then motel, noted her lover's license plate, then did his research. He had no plan when he confronted her. For the sake of the children, he may have forgiven her if she'd been suitably remorseful and convinced him it would never happen again. Her actual reaction shocked, appalled, but most importantly, offended him. He left to calm down, to avoid physically hurting her. Cheap, commercially available, telephone and email bugs provided the data necessary to fulfill the rest of his plan. The whiskey bottle beckoned to him still. Why not? The kids were in bed, it would be harmless. That made him sad. Tomorrow he'd have to have that conversation with his kids. They wouldn't be seeing their mom for a while. Well, not unless she found another source of bail money. That was a conversation he really wasn't looking forward to. He thought back to the paperwork shuffle he'd accomplished at work today. With luck and only a cursory audit, the missing sleeping pills would never be missed. If one of 6 customers actually counted the pills in the bottle and reported them 1 short, then he'd get a slight reprimand. He idly picked up his phone and deleted the tracking program. Then he deleted a few contacts he would never need again. Lynn, Maria. Checking his bank balance online showed him that all their old joint account balances had all been transferred to his new account. The balance was consistent with the contents of Lynn's secret account being added as well. As soon as he'd come to terms with the fact his wife could be deceptive, he'd gone looking. The arrogance of the woman. Putting the statements in a folder next to the regular accounts. relying on the fact that he took little interest in the family finances, them being her domain throughout their marriage. Her password had been predictable. He shook his head. How long had she known him? Did she really believe he'd contemplate, for even a second, leading the life of a fool? To give up the pride he knew was the cornerstone of his belief system? She knew he would do anything for his kids. How much easier it would be to fight for them. He rubbed his sore knee. Bloody, cheap Japanese cars. The dashboard shouldn't collapse after the car hit a small brick wall. He poured himself a generous drink. For medicinal purposes only, you understand. Pulling out his checklist, he double-checked everything was completed, then lit it with the firelighter and threw it into the fireplace. As he watched it burn, he scoured his brain for anything he'd missed, but once again could not find a base uncovered. He took another sip, and for the first time in weeks, fully relaxed. That'll do, Dave. That'll do.